Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good to be with you. Let me ask you, it was 12 degrees below zero this morning when I woke. Did you ever expect to see 12 degrees below zero in that first time ever? I mean, it's been cold other times, but 12 below. And up by our President Evan in New Hampshire, you can imagine around 15 below, right? 14? Okay. So it's a new thing. And it's good at times to experience new things, maybe not 12 below, but new things can be good. I have something I want to discuss with you today that had been on my mind for a long time, never spoke about it publicly ever, but I think it's an important subject. It's a subject about which I gave a class at the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute this past month, and where the classes normally are, 4 people, 6 people, 8 people. This one I had 52 people. And it was apparently about something important. I talked about angels. And I think many people wonder, are angels real? And what has that got to do with me? So my subject this morning is to take a summary of the last of the sessions that I taught at MJTI, and hopefully encourage you by bringing something new to your attention that you may not have thought about before, but which you may end up feeling is important. Now, of course, we've been studying the Exodus because that's the section of the Torah that we've been reading lately, and it's so interesting. You'll recall that Pharaoh thought he had us. His armies were coming, we believe, in 2 directions. One, down the steep, rocky paths, down to what I believe to be the Gulf of Aqaba. Scholars debate about the exact location, but anyhow, and he was coming down that way, and I would suggest that he split his forces and took some north, and they came down the coast. So we were really trapped. And then, at the last minute, as we were crying out and wondering, is this the end after all the tsuris, all the trouble of getting out of Egypt? Is it going to end with us all being hacked to pieces? And we read how God sent a pillar of fire and interposed that pillar of fire between us and the Egyptian army the previous night. And there's a very interesting passage in Exodus 14. Vayasa ma'alach ha'elohim ha'holek lifnei machane Yisrael. Then the angel of God, who was going before in the midst of Israel, moved and went before them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. So an angel interposes itself and has the appearance of a pillar and cloud, and we don't know the physics of it, but clearly the Hebrew says an angel. So again, we're talking about angels this morning. Now, I would like to do something, again, a little bit different in that I would like to introduce you to a person who's had some influence, a lot of influence on me as we consider the role of angels. Are they real? And do they help us today? And her name is Lorna Byrne. Now, she was born in 1953 in Belfast, Ireland, to a poor family, a stable family, but a poor family. And she makes some radical claims about her experiences ever since she was a baby. I would like you to hear not her voice, but the voice of a professional reader who's reading out loud on audible.com, reading her book called Angels in My Hair, Lorna Byrne.
When I was 2 years old, the doctor told my mother I was retarded. When I was a baby, my mother noticed that I always seemed to be in a world of my own.
I can even remember lying in a cot, a big basket, and seeing my mother bending over me. Surrounding my mother, I saw wonderful, bright, shiny beings in all the colours of the rainbow. They were much bigger than I was, but smaller than her, about the size of a 3-year-old child. These beings floated in the air like feathers, and I remember reaching out to touch them, but I never succeeded. I was fascinated by these creatures with their beautiful lights. At that time, I didn't understand that I was seeing anything different from what other people saw. It would be much later that I learned from them that they were called angels. As the months passed, my mother noticed that I'd always be looking or staring somewhere else, no matter what she'd do to try to get my attention. In truth, I was somewhere else. I was away with the angels, watching what they were doing and talking and playing with them. I was enthralled. I was a late talker, but I had been conversing with angels from very early on. Sometimes we used words as you and I understand them, but sometimes no words were needed. We would know each other's thoughts. I believed that everyone else could see what I saw, but then the angels told me that I was not to say anything to anyone about seeing them, that I should keep it a secret between us. In fact, for many years, I listened to the angels and I didn't tell people what I saw. It is only now, in writing this book, that I am for the first time telling much of what I have seen. I have been given visions on many occasions throughout my life. When I was about 10, I was out in the fields walking along the river, and the angel said, "Just up here we are going to meet Elijah." "Who's Elijah?" I asked. I laughed at the name, Elijah. I had never heard it before, and I thought it sounded lovely. The angels weren't laughing, though. "Elijah is going to show you something, Lorna. You must try to remember, because this is part of your future." An angel walked toward me across the river from the far bank. It's hard to describe him. He was a rusty color, that rusty amber color that has a little red in it, and absolutely beautiful. He seemed to shine, and his clothes were long, draping over him as his sleeves did over his hands. Yet when he raised his arms, the long sleeves seemed to roll back so gracefully, as if they were a part of him. Elijah's face even seemed to be that same rusty amber color. I was fascinated to see Elijah walking on the river. He was coming toward me, but his feet were not touching the water. "Can I do that too?" I asked. He just laughed at me. The ground was uneven on the river bank with big tufts of grass. Elijah invited me to sit down beside him and smiled. "I'm glad to see you are not nervous with me." "No, they told me you were coming," I replied. As I looked around, I realized that all the angels who were usually with me had disappeared, except my guardian angel. "Where have they all gone?" I said. "They have gone away for a while," he said. "Now I'm going to hold your hand, Lorna." He held out his hand to me, and I put my hand in his. All I can say is, it was as if my hand got lost in his, as if my hand became part of his hand. "I don't want you to feel afraid," he said, "because there is nothing to be afraid of. This is something that you can look forward to when you grow up, something that will happen to you." "Why do I need to know it now?" I asked. He didn't answer my question and instead said, "You will see someone and we will tell you about this person you are seeing." Then it was as if a curtain had been pulled back, and I was watching this big, huge screen in the middle of the river in front of me. In the vision, I could see a pathway surrounded by trees. I seemed to be sitting at the far end of the pathway, and I could see a figure in the distance starting to walk through the trees along the path. I looked at Elijah beside me and said, "I can't see very well." "Keep watching," he replied. As the figure got closer, I could see it was an extremely tall young man with red hair. He was very, very handsome as far as I could make out. Then Elijah started talking again. You can see him quite clearly now. I turned to the angel sitting beside me and nodded. Keep looking, he said. We want you to remember what he looks like. We won't show you any more, but what I need to tell you is that this will be the young man you will marry. You will recognize him from this vision the first time you see him, many years from now. But you have to grow up first. I smiled and giggled at the idea of being in love or married and asked Elijah, "Is he big like that now?" "No," Elijah replied. "He is only a young boy too, a few years older than you are." Elijah continued talking. "You will be very happy with him. He will love you and you will love him. You will have ups and downs, good times and not so good times. You will have healthy children and they will all be very special too. But you will end up looking after him, and God won't leave him with you forever. You won't grow old together." I turned and looked at him and said, "What do you mean, Elijah, looking after him?" "His health won't be the best," Elijah replied. "God will take him one day, when he is still quite young." "I really don't want to know that," I said. But Elijah continued, "Lorna, don't get cross. We just want you to remember. We're preparing you for the future, preparing you to be strong. Think of all the love and happiness that you'll have. Just look at how handsome he is. You said so yourself." I looked again and I could see him and I said, "Yes, he's nice." Then the vision was gone and Elijah asked, "Will you remember that?" "Yes," I replied. "I will remember, and I understand that he won't be staying with me forever and that I will have to look after him." One day, while we were sitting there by the river, I saw a wonderful example of the way angels care for us. I watched a mother and a little child, maybe about 18 months old, at the edge of the river. The little child was full of excitement at the water running over his feet, and the mother had her hands around his waist, trying to teach him to get his balance and to stand on his own. Sometimes she took her hand away to see how long he could keep his balance and not fall. I watched the child's guardian angel sitting in the water under him. The child's legs became a little wobbly and he went down. The mother couldn't catch the child in time, but the angel did. As the child went splashing into the water, he landed right in his angel's lap in a sitting position. Instead of crying, he started to splash the water and laugh. I smiled at this. Joe asked me, "What are you smiling so happily about?" I smiled at him and said nothing. Yet again I passed up the opportunity to let Joe know a little of what I could see. He was the only person I shared anything of my life with, but I was afraid to tell him about the angels in case he would think I wasn't all there.
That's extraordinary stuff, right? Now the question is it true? And if it's true, what does that mean? So what I thought might be helpful is for me to take you through the thought process that I would suggest whenever we encounter someone making extraordinary claims, because her claims are extraordinary. I mean, that she sees angels all the time, that she had an encounter with an angel calling itself Elijah, that she was told in advance many things about her life. Well, I have read her book. Well, I've listened to it. I like Audible a lot, so I've listened to it, I would guess, 10 times. No exaggeration. And I want to, again, distill for you the thought process that I went through and always try and go through so that you can discern if something is legit or not. And so this is a little bit of a gift I wanted to give you, which hopefully will be helpful to you not only today, but just in general in life. Okay? So these are the questions I asked about Lorna, and which I commend to you. So here's first question. Does the person reporting the event seem mentally stable? Now I'll tell you about a very interesting syndrome called the Jerusalem syndrome. The Jerusalem syndrome, and it has a funny side, but it's not funny, but there is a humorous side. Maybe because of the spiritual intensity of Jerusalem as the axis mundi, the place where heaven and earth connect, maybe because of that, or maybe because people visiting have such high expectations for having spiritual experience, or a combination of the above, or maybe of both, or maybe there are other factors that we're not aware of. The Jerusalem syndrome, where all of a sudden people just decide they're Yeshua, or Moses, or Eliyahu. And there is actually a ward in a hospital where people with this condition are treated. Now, again, the humorous part is you just imagine coming over the loudspeaker, well, Elijah, please come to room 209 for your session. All the Elijahs show up. And you imagine one saying, man, it's great being Elijah. And the other guy goes, yeah, I know. I'm Elijah. Excuse me? You're not Elijah. I'm Elijah. I mean, you can imagine the scenes. But again, I don't want to trivialize it. It is a recognized mental condition, and why. So the point is, when we're evaluating people who make really out there kind of claims, it begs the question, are they well put together psychologically? It's a fair question, and you deserve to be able to ask it because these are extraordinary claims that are being made. Let me share another question that I always mentally ask myself. Does the person seem to have integrity? That is he or she lying to get fame or money or whatever? Very important question. Sad to say, there are liars out there. There are people who will exploit the naivete and gullibility of others to make a killing. And we have to ask ourselves the question, if we're going to come to truth, is the person not telling the truth? And it's a critical question, and in the interest of time, but I could think of an example, a very important example from the 17th century in Europe and North Africa, and that is Shabatai Zvi, the infamous Messianic claimant, who amassed roughly 1 million followers in Europe and in North Africa and even into South America. And, you know, it's hard to know his exact mental state, but when he was in Constantinople and the Sultan says, listen, you either convert to Islam or you're dead. What do you think he chose to do? Converted to Islam. Well, that doesn't speak too highly of the moral character of the person involved. So those are two tests. Is the person well put together psychologically? Do they seem to have a real issue? And are they honest? Does the person pay a price for living with his or her claims? Things like the rejection of friends, family, etc. Now that isn't necessarily by itself an indication of truthfulness. But if a person is really willing to pay a price for what they believe in, certainly it kicks up a notch our willingness to think that maybe they really believe what they're saying are true. But no one test is conclusive. In fact, even the totality isn't conclusive, but it's an important question to ask. Does the person making the great claims exhibit the kinds of the qualities of character they enjoin upon their hearers and readers? So that's an important one. Do they keep up the high standards that they enjoined upon others. Well, Shvatai Zvi enjoined upon Israel fidelity to Torah. Of course, he interpreted it in such a way that he led a very licentious life, and even among his inner circle and followers, he commended that. So there was certainly a disconnect that the rabbis of the day noted, that this guy makes claims of fidelity to Moses and yet lives completely outside them. It's a very important question. Yeshua spoke about this when he said, beware of false prophets. He said, every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. Very important to keep in mind as a test. Here's another test. Does the story change in important ways over time? That's real important. And as I've listened to people like Lorna, there's another person I listen to who has nothing to do with angels particularly, but it's an extraordinary story. In fact, a couple of people, I've listened very carefully for a kind of evolution in the story that suggests that what he said back here is not what he's saying here. It's an important test. Now, minor changes in the way a story is told is perfectly legitimate and to be expected of truth tellers. I'll give you an example from the Besorah, from the New Testament. There's an account of Yeshua and his followers going across the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, to the other side where there was a place called Decapolis, meaning 10 towns, 10 cities, Decapolis. It was a Gentile area. And when they landed the boat, and you'll recall this story, when they landed the boat, there were cliffs there which were riddled with caves. And one account, there were different accounts, there were a few in the Gospels, but I'll just mention the basic difference between them. In one account, 2 men appear before Yeshua at the shore, 2 demonized men. In the other kind of account, in the other account, it's 1 demonized person. Well, the skeptic could say, well, obviously you have a contradiction in the Bible here. I mean, you claim that it's the Word of God, but you have this glaring, obvious contradiction. And what I would say is no, not at all. As a matter of fact, if all 4 Gospels were exactly alike in every detail, that would beg the question of collusion. That is, the writers got together, made up a story, and decided to not leave any loopholes. But when truth is told about the same event, often you have details which are not exactly the same. So if you were to see a car accident, if we all together were outside and we saw a car accident, and the police came by and interviewed us what happened, there would be slight differences in detail. But that's a mark of truth, not a mark of untruth. But when we talk about a radical change in perspective, where all of a sudden the message here is not the message there, that should raise red flags. In Lorna's particular case, I have not found it to be the case at all, and I have paid plenty of attention, believe me. Okay, here's another test for you. Do the claims made agree or disagree substantially with key dimensions of your own worldview? Now that's an important thing. You've got to evaluate radical claims in terms of things that you already think are possible and impossible. Now, this is not airtight because the whole thing about growth is being willing to bring new information, new ideas, new perspectives, and without that, you'll never grow as a human being. On the other hand, it's reasonable to ask to what extent does a person say things that are just really apart from my worldview. Now, at least superficially, I have found some things in Lorna that I'm not particularly wild about. And I don't need to get into great detail, but you know, the point is, she has this idea of, she wishes all religions could be under one big tent. Well, understood one way, I fiercely disagree with that because I don't think that every religious expression is equally the same. I think there is a uniqueness to Yeshua, and to the extent that a faith recognizes his uniqueness, and I'd say the uniqueness and covenant calling of Am Yisrael, I would include that as one of those rock bottom understandings. To the extent that someone disallows that, I would say, well, I don't know. I don't know, doesn't sound right to me. Now, I'm being a little tough here because she can mean that in a more benign way. Meaning one day when everything is good in the world because God has set up his kingdom, distinctions between this group and that group will not be nearly as meaningful. I don't know, but I'm just pointing it out as something that elevates my not totally sure here. Shouldn't be afraid of that. Another test, and we're almost done with this section. Do credible detractors contradict the claims made? Are there people who know and say, listen, I knew that person when they were a kid. They claim to be such and such. It's not true. We went to high school together. It is not true, not true. Well, it's a reasonable question. Are there credible detractors? In this particular case, I don't think so. I haven't encountered any, but you never know. And last of what I want to share with you now on this subject, there's more to talk about. Perhaps in Oneg we can explore this together, sit together. But what benefit comes from embracing an extraordinary account? Are you encouraged? Are you ennobled? Are you inspired? Are you comforted? In the case of unsettling or difficult truths, do new insights move you to act courageously? Now, these are very, very important questions. And I think that God does do amazing, amazing things. And I'm going to introduce you to one more story, not about Lorna Byrne. But I just want you to have what at Ruach Israel I like to call, and we like to call, a cool head and a warm heart. The best way to come to truth in life is to recognize that the mind is a gift from God, and you can't bypass rationality and thinking to get to truth. However, if you're just locked up here, you will miss some of the most important truths that you could possibly know. Because truth and knowing truth is also a matter of the kishkas, the inner yes or the inner no. That emotional, call it an emotional dynamic, but it's deeper than that. It's a spiritual thing. It's something that's accompanies rationality, but it's not the same thing. And you got to have both operating if you're going to come to more truth than you have now. You got to have both, and we stand for both. And so I want to encourage you along those lines. We have one more story. I'm going to ask Michelle if she'd come up and read you a totally different story, mostly to encourage your hearts and your minds today. But listen to another story about an angel.
This story is called Rescue in the Snow, and it starts out with this poem by William Blake. Silent move the feet of angels bright. Unseen, they pour blessing and joy without ceasing. When 9-year-old Buddy awakened on Saturday before dawn, there was more than a foot of snow on the ground. But he wasn't about to let a little bad weather keep him from a most important job. Buddy had just become an acolyte and was assigned to serve the 6 a.m. Mass that day. When Buddy came downstairs, his mother was still in her bathrobe. "The roads haven't been plowed, honey," she said, peering out at the dark, deserted street. "I can't drive you to church. We'll get stuck. Maybe you'd better stay home." "No, Mom. A promise was a promise. I can walk. Honest, it'll be fun." Buddy's mother looked doubtful. It was almost 2 miles to church, but their little Ohio town was peaceful and safe. What harm could possibly come to her son? It made her proud to see him taking his responsibilities so seriously. "Well, all right," she smiled. "Be sure to bundle up." At first, because his route was downhill, breaking a path through the new snow was fun. Buddy hiked down the middle of Main Street in the darkness with no people or cars around. It was a winter wonderland, all quiet and clean. But as he walked on, the drifts from blowing snow seemed to grow higher and higher. His legs began to ache. He longed to reach the church so someone there would help him in and seat him near a heater to warm his quickly freezing fingers and toes. Finally, Buddy arrived at the front of the church. He was dismayed to realize that the snow on the church steps was completely undisturbed. He must be the first one there. The walk had taken longer than expected. Shouldn't the priest or other parishioners have arrived by now? Using the side of his boot, Buddy pushed the snow aside until he could finally drag open the front door. At last, he fell inside, then stared at the cold, empty interior. By the light of the just rising sun, he could see the clock above the door. It was already 6:15. He had been the only one to struggle through the snow. There would be no Mass today. Buddy knelt in a back pew for a moment, where he began to notice just how worn out he was. His legs throbbed from pushing through the drifts, and he would have to do it all over again to get home. God, Buddy murmured, please help me get home. The way home seemed endless, each step a struggle. For every little distance Buddy gained, he seemed to fall back even farther, pushed by the rising wind and his own exhaustion. Although it was daylight now, the streets were still empty. There was no one to ask for shelter or help. Buddy had to go uphill, and he looked with dread at the long distance remaining. He wasn't going to make it. He knew that for sure. His legs had been pushing through almost waist-high snow for what felt like hours, and all he wanted to do was lie down, end this terrible journey, and close his eyes. That's when he noticed that someone was behind him. A large man with kind eyes was smiling down at Buddy. Buddy was surprised that he hadn't heard the man's boots crunching through the snow as he walked up from behind, but there hadn't been a sound. Buddy stared at the stranger. A woolen scarf hid most of his face, but oddly, Buddy felt no fear of him. The man said nothing. He simply picked Buddy up from behind, lifted him over his head, set Buddy on his shoulders, and began to walk. How strong he was, and where had he come from? Buddy felt exhilarated yet peaceful, all at the same time. It seemed that he and the man were wrapped in warmth, an awesome connection that Buddy didn't want to break by asking questions. Yet, he would have to tell the stranger where he lived. But as they approached the house, the stranger turned and walked right down Buddy's long front sidewalk. How had he known? They reached the porch, and the man silently lowered his head and helped Buddy slide off his shoulders. "Thank you, sir." Buddy immediately turned out for a last view. But there was no one behind him, no one at all. And although Buddy could see footprints up the sidewalk to where he stood, there were no tracks leading away from the porch. Buddy stood in astonishment, surveying the scene. His rescuer had gone as quickly as he'd arrived. It took a while for Buddy to understand who the stranger was. He never saw the man again. But I don't need to, Buddy says today. I know he's still here, ready to help me again when I need him.
Thank you, Michelle. Yasher Koach. It's a great story. It's a great story, yeah. Now here's the thing. In the Exodus, we read about an angel interposing itself and protecting us at the time. And we ask ourselves about the Exodus story. Why is the story so important to us? Why do we invest it with so much interest, and it becomes one of the main points of Jewish and Messianic Jewish understanding? It's because the Exodus is not only the story of the rescue of our people, but the Exodus represents something that all of us yearn for. You see, we all understand something about slavery, and we all yearn for G'ilah, for rescue, and we all look forward to the promised land. I just want to say this, when it comes to stories like Lorna's and the story of this little boy, I want to encourage you to investigate further, because maybe the realities of angels actually helping us can help you on your journey. I am convinced that there's something to it, and I want to encourage you to read her book. Use the criteria that I described, which will keep you from wishful thinking, but will help you along the way, because I think that she actually is quite a credible person. And so I want to suggest that to as your next step. May the Exodus account, Lorna's experience, and the experience of a little boy caught in a snowstorm help us all on our way to the promised land. Shabbat Shalom to all of you.
Thank you, Rabbi Rich, for bringing us some warm, cozy stories on well, it's not snowy, but it might as well be.
Right.
How cold it is today. And it's just it's a wonderful thing to see that, the Lord is with us, just like he was in the Exodus, is with us today in many different ways. And may we be privileged to be able to see those things and experience his presence with us. Why don't we rise, and we'll close with Yelena on page 93.